Mark was a quiet boy with an almost shy presence. He was young, probably not much older than 15, but his determination was written in the way he held himself. It was his first time attending a big music competition, and everything about the place seemed intimidating. The room was filled with the usual nervous energy of young musicians hoping for their big break. But what stood out about Mark was his calmness. While others fidgeted, adjusted their clothes, or practiced their pieces over and over, Mark sat quietly in the corner, waiting for his turn. The audition room was sleek and professional, filled with a row of judges and a long grand piano in the center. The judges, a mix of experienced musicians and industry veterans, looked bored. They had seen countless auditions by now, and most of them followed the same pattern. A hopeful young talent walks in, plays a piece, and leaves the room disappointed when they don't make the cut. They'd heard it all before, and they were jaded. Music was no longer a passion for them. It was a job, a formality. They were quick to judge and even quicker to dismiss what they felt was unworthy. As Mark walked to the piano, one of the judges, the director, couldn't help but chuckle. The boy looked different from the others. His clothes were simple, a little worn down, and there was something in his eyes that made the director think he had no business being there. He had seen it 100 times, the nervous young hopeful who believed they had talent, but couldn't quite back it up. So in a moment of sarcasm, the director made a joke. "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. The other judges laughed along with him, not expecting anything extraordinary from the boy. After all, this was just another audition, and they had seen enough to know how it would end. But Mark didn't react to the laughter or the joke. He simply sat down at the piano with a quiet focus, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. The director and the judges were still, laughing among themselves when Mark began to play. At first, the music was soft, hesitant almost, as if Mark was warming up. The judges paid little attention to it, continuing their side conversations, thinking the boy would fumble and make mistakes like so many others had. They had already decided he wasn't going to be any different. But as Mark's hands began to move with more confidence, the room started to grow quiet. The melody that emerged wasn't flashy or showy, but there was something special about it, a kind of raw emotion that couldn't be ignored. The director, who had been leaning back in his chair, arms crossed and eyes half closed, suddenly felt a shift in the air. He looked up, his smile fading as he listened more carefully. The music was simple, but it was also beautiful in a way that he hadn't expected. It was as if Mark wasn't just playing the piano. He was telling a story with every note. The more the boy played, the more the director felt his initial judgment starting to crumble. Something about Mark's performance felt different. There was an honesty to it, a sincerity that was missing in many of the polished, rehearsed performances the judges were used to hearing. For the first time, the director's laughter died down completely. The boy was playing with a level of emotion and skill that wasn't immediately obvious from the way he looked. The director had expected another typical forgettable audition. Instead, he was now captivated, unsure of what was happening but knowing he was witnessing something unusual. The room, which had once been filled with casual chatter and laughter, now felt completely still. The director's attention was fully on the boy at the piano, but still, there was doubt. Was it really as good as it seemed? Could it be a fluke? The director wasn't ready to admit that his initial judgment might have been wrong. But there was no denying it. The boy's music was beginning to make an impression. The melody seemed to reach into the hearts of those in the room, even the most skeptical judges. They were no longer talking. Instead, they were listening, as if they were waiting for something more. The piece wasn't finished yet, but it was already clear. Mark had something no one had expected. And the director? He was beginning to wonder if, just maybe, he might have to eat his words. As Mark's fingers gently touched the keys of the grand piano, the room seemed to hold its breath. The sound that filled the air was not the hesitant, nervous playing one might expect from a young boy on the verge of an important audition. It wasn't a sound full of mistakes or awkward pauses. It was something entirely different. Mark's touch was delicate at first, almost as if he was testing the waters, unsure of how the judges might react. His hands hovered over the keys for a brief moment, before diving into the first few notes. Soft and steady, the judges, initially still caught up in their own conversations and thoughts, suddenly became aware of the music that had filled the room. There was something disarming about the way Mark played. It wasn't technically perfect, but it didn't need to be. The melody flowed like a stream, with each note cascading into the next as if the boy wasn't just playing an instrument, but rather communicating something deep from within. The music seemed to have a life of its own, pulling the listeners into a world of pure emotion and vulnerability. At first, the director continued to lean back in his chair, his arms crossed and a smirk still playing on his lips. He was waiting for the inevitable falter, some misstep, some sign that this would be just another unremarkable audition. But as the seconds passed, something shifted. The room, which had been filled with idle chatter just moments before, grew eerily silent. The judges, one by one, began to turn their attention toward Mark, their eyes narrowing in curiosity. The music wasn't just filling the room, it was consuming it. Mark's hands moved over the piano with surprising skill, the rhythm deepening, the melody becoming more intricate, yet still flowing with the same effortless grace. Mark's gaze remained fixed on the piano as he played. His fingers glided effortlessly over the keys, as though they were guided by something beyond technique. It was as if he was no longer simply playing notes, but channeling an emotion so raw and powerful that the sound became almost physical. The music was rich with tension, a delicate balance between strength and fragility. Every chord seemed to carry a weight, a history, and the more he played, the more the room seemed to vibrate with an energy that was undeniable. The director, his arms still crossed, finally uncrossed them, leaning forward in his chair. The smirk that had been on his face at the start of the audition had slowly faded, replaced by an expression of surprise. He had expected nothing more than an average performance, maybe a few decent notes, but certainly not the kind of music that made you pause and reconsider everything you thought you knew. And yet, as Mark's fingers continued to move, something began to stir inside the director. There was a fire in the boy's playing, an intensity that he had only seen in a handful of truly gifted musicians. It wasn't flashy or over the top, but there was a quiet, commanding strength in every note. The director glanced at the other judges, who, like him, were now leaning forward in their chairs. Their faces had lost the bored expressions they had worn at the beginning of the audition, replaced instead by looks of confusion, awe, and curiosity. One of the judges, a woman known for her strict standards, sat with her mouth slightly open, her eyes locked on Mark as though she were trying to understand how this boy, who had walked in looking so ordinary, could produce such extraordinary music. There was no denying it, Mark was playing in a way that was far beyond his years. The melody began to build in complexity, each note layered with meaning. Mark was no longer playing just for the sake of playing. He was pouring something into the music, something deeply personal. The way his fingers moved, so sure and yet so fragile, told a story that no words could convey. It was as if he was unlocking parts of himself with every note, revealing emotions that were too complex for language to express. The room seemed to shrink, all other thoughts and distractions fading away as the music took center stage. For a moment, the director forgot about the playful joke he had made earlier. He was no longer focused on the sarcastic remark he had made about kneeling. The boy at the piano had done something unexpected. He had made the director forget his preconceived notions, forget his doubts, and simply listen. And the music he was hearing was not just good, it was captivating. It was as if Mark was speaking to something deep within the director, something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The piece seemed to grow in emotional depth as Mark continued to play. each chord resonating more powerfully than the last. The energy in the room shifted. What had started as a quiet, unassuming audition had turned into something profound, something unforgettable. The director shifted in his seat, his mind racing. How could this boy, this seemingly shy and ordinary boy, create such an extraordinary sound? Where had this talent come from? Mark finished the piece with a final lingering note that seemed to hang in the air. The room was completely still, almost as if the world itself had stopped moving. Mark slowly lifted his hands from the keys and sat back, waiting. His eyes were still fixed on the piano, but there was a quiet confidence in his posture now. He had played his heart out, and though he didn't look for praise, he seemed to know that something had shifted in that room. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched on, thick with disbelief and admiration. The director, who had once laughed at the idea of this boy impressing him, now found himself speechless, unsure of how to react. What he had just heard was something he had not expected, something that had completely shattered his initial skepticism. And in that silence, as the last note of Mark's music echoed in the air, the director knew that this was a moment he would never forget. As Mark's fingers left the keys, and the last note of the piece reverberated through the room, a strange silence filled the air. For a few seconds, it felt as though the music had become part of the very walls, lingering in the space between each person, refusing to leave. The director, who had been so quick to make a joke just minutes earlier, was now utterly still, his face a mixture of disbelief and awe. The rest of the judges, who had once been so skeptical, were now caught in the same spell. They sat frozen, their eyes wide, unwilling to break the magic that had just unfolded in front of them. Mark remained seated at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys, as if he were waiting for the sound of his music to fade completely before moving. He didn't look at the judges, didn't search their faces for approval or praise. His expression was one of quiet satisfaction, as if he knew he had done something special, but wasn't quite sure if they would understand it. It was clear that this performance wasn't just about impressing them. It was something more personal, a release, a way for him to show the world something he had kept hidden. The silence stretched on, the room filled with an eerie, almost palpable tension. The judges exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. No one had expected anything like this. Not from a boy who had walked in looking so ordinary, so uncertain. They had all anticipated a standard, forgettable audition, a nice piece of music that would fade into the countless others they had already heard. But what they had just witnessed was something that went far beyond technical skill or a well-rehearsed performance. It was raw, emotional, and undeniably powerful. Finally, it was the woman sitting to the far right of the director who broke the silence. She cleared her throat softly, as if reluctant to disturb the moment, but unable to stay silent any longer. "That was something else," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the effect the music had on her. The director, still caught in the grip of Mark's performance, nodded slowly, though he didn't immediately speak. His mouth was dry, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. He had been so certain that the boy would fall short, that his joke had been nothing more than a casual remark. But now he realized how wrong he had been. Mark had not only played the piano, he had made the instrument come alive. He had turned a simple audition into something unforgettable. The other judges, one by one, began to murmur their approval, though none of them seemed able to put into words exactly what they had just experienced. It wasn't just about the notes or the performance. It was about the soul behind it, the vulnerability that Mark had poured into each chord. It was something they hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. The kind of raw, unfiltered passion that only a few true artists could bring to life. The director stood up slowly, his body moving as if in a trance, and walked toward the piano. He paused for a moment, looking down at Mark, who remained seated, his gaze still fixed on the piano keys. There was a part of the director that wanted to dismiss the performance, to tell himself it had all been some kind of fluke. But he couldn't do it. Not after hearing what he had just heard. Without a word, the director did something he had never done before. He dropped to one knee right there in front of the piano. It was a gesture of respect, one that spoke louder than any words could. The room, still reeling from the intensity of the music, held its breath once again. The director's sudden movement was unexpected, but it was the only thing that seemed to make sense in that moment. He had promised half-jokingly that if the boy played, he would kneel. Now, with the music still lingering in the air, the director found himself honoring that promise, but it was far more than just a joke. It was a recognition of the boy's extraordinary talent, a silent admission that he had underestimated him in the most profound way. Mark looked up, his face still unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't react with surprise. He simply nodded slightly, as if he had already known this moment would come. He had poured everything into his music, and now the director had given him something unexpected in return: respect. The moment felt almost sacred, as though the music had bridged the gap between them, breaking down the walls that separated the boy from the powerful world of music and the people who controlled it. The other judges sat in stunned silence, not quite sure how to respond to the director's gesture. Some were still processing the depth of the performance, while others were beginning to understand just how rare it was to witness something like this. There was no denying that Mark had transformed the audition room into something far beyond a simple competition. He had shown them all that there was more to music than technique, more to talent than what could be measured in notes and scales. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the director stood up, his expression now serious. "That was beyond anything I could have imagined," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes still held the awe he was trying to conceal. "You've earned more than just a place in this competition. You've earned the respect of everyone in this room." The boy Mark finally allowed himself to let out a small, quiet breath, as if the weight of the moment had just begun to sink in. The journey ahead would still be long and filled with challenges, but for now, he had proven that talent, passion, and authenticity could break through even the toughest skepticism. And in that instant, Mark realized that he had already won. He had shown the world who he was, and nothing could take that away. As the applause slowly faded, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The director stood with a solemn expression, the kind that usually accompanied moments of grave reflection, as though he were struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had just unfolded. The other judges, still caught in the echo of Mark's music, remained seated, their minds racing as they processed the unexpected turn of events. The boy at the piano, Mark, seemed as though he had stepped out of the room and into a different space altogether. His fingers still rested on the keys, but his gaze was distant, lost, it seemed, in the deep well of his own thoughts. The director could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. There was something undeniable about Mark's performance, something that transcended all the usual metrics of talent and technique. It wasn't about the flawless execution of a well-known piece or the precision of every note. It was about the rawness of the emotion, the vulnerability, the honesty that bled through every key he struck. The music wasn't just coming from the piano, it was coming from Mark's very soul. And the director had witnessed it in full force. The director slowly walked back to his seat, the click of his shoes echoing louder than usual in the tense silence. The other judges remained still, their eyes fixed on Mark, almost as if they were afraid to break the spell. Everyone was caught in a moment of profound realization. They had witnessed something rare, a true artist revealing himself in a way no one had expected. What they had thought was an average audition had transformed into something extraordinary. He looked at Mark, who still hadn't spoken, his hands lightly resting on the piano, as if he were holding the remnants of the music still floating in the air. Mark's posture was relaxed but filled with an underlying strength. It was as if the performance had taken everything he had, but it had also empowered him. The boy wasn't just playing a song anymore. He had left pieces of himself on the keys, something personal, something no one in the room could ignore. "Do you know what you just did?" the director asked, his voice quieter than usual. He wasn't asking out of mockery or disbelief. He was genuinely curious. He was grappling with the fact that he had underestimated this boy in the most profound way. Mark didn't answer immediately. He lifted his hands from the piano and sat back, his eyes finally lifting from the keys. He looked at the director, and for the first time in the audition, there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. It wasn't arrogance or pride. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the moment, a moment he had known all along would come. He didn't need to speak because he had already said everything in the music. His performance had done all the talking. I just played what I felt," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that spoke volumes. There was no need for elaborate explanations. The music had already conveyed everything. The director sat back down, slowly rubbing his forehead as though trying to shake off the realization that his judgment had been completely wrong. He had dismissed the boy, thought he would be another forgettable audition, another name lost in a sea of hopefuls. But Mark had proven him wrong, spectacularly wrong. "Felt? What you just played." The director trailed off, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. "You didn't just play notes. You brought the room to life. You made us feel something we weren't expecting." Mark nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corner of his lips. He wasn't seeking praise. He was simply acknowledging that, for the first time, someone had truly understood him. It was a moment of validation, a quiet triumph that spoke louder than any applause could. The director had seen through the layers, beyond the surface, and had recognized something far greater than just a good performance. The other judges were no longer as distant as they had been at the start of the audition. One by one, they leaned in, exchanging looks of astonishment. The woman who had spoken first now turned to Mark, her eyes wide with an almost childlike wonder. "Where did that come from?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "I've never heard anything like it before." Mark shrugged, a humble gesture that spoke of a life lived with music, one that had shaped him, taught him, and led him to this very moment. "Music is. It's everything I have," he said simply, as though that explained it all. And perhaps in a way, it did. Music had been his refuge, his escape, and his voice. It was the one thing that made him feel alive, and in this moment, it was the one thing that had finally connected him with the world. The director, still processing everything, leaned forward. "Mark, right?" he asked, his voice still soft but full of respect now. "You've got a gift. And I don't say that lightly. I've been in this business for a long time, and I can tell when someone is the real deal." Mark met his gaze, and this time, there was no uncertainty in his eyes. He had come in unsure of what to expect, unsure if he would even make it through the audition. But now, standing in front of the director and the judges, Mark realized that he had just changed the course of his life. And this was just the beginning. The director paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before continuing. "You're in. And I'm not just talking about this competition. I'm talking about everything. You have a future in this world, Mark, and we'll help you get there." For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark allowed himself to feel a sense of relief, a deep, quiet relief that spread through his chest. He had done it, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever doubted him, for everyone who had ever underestimated him. And the journey, it seemed, was only just beginning. The following days after Mark's audition felt like a blur, as if time had bent around the powerful moment he had created in that room. The music had stayed with him, lingering in his mind, like a melody that refused to let go. Yet, the outside world had shifted dramatically, and Mark was struggling to keep up with the whirlwind of attention that had suddenly swept him into the spotlight. It wasn't just the judges, reactions, or the director's unexpected respect. News of his performance had spread like wildfire. Within hours, his audition was the talk of the music world. The story of the boy who walked in quietly, with no visible evidence of the talent he held, and then stunned everyone in the room, was impossible to ignore. The media, industry insiders, and even fellow musicians began to look at Mark with a mix of awe and curiosity. It was as though he had suddenly gone from being an unknown to a figure of immense interest. But for Mark, it all felt overwhelming. He had never dreamed of such attention. He had always kept to himself, practicing in quiet corners of his world. Now suddenly, his name was being spoken in rooms he had never even imagined being part of. The director had spoken highly of him to the press, and even his harshest critics couldn't help but admit that Mark had something extraordinary. Yet, despite all the praise, Mark still felt like an outsider in this world that seemed so far removed from his humble beginnings. It was the director who called him first, just a few days after the audition, pulling Mark out of his daze and reminding him of the opportunity that lay before him. "Mark, are you free tomorrow?" The director's voice crackled through the phone, steady and confident. "I think it's time we have a conversation about what happens next." Mark's heart raced. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. "Sure," he managed to say, keeping his voice even, though his mind was buzzing with questions. "I'll be there." The next day, Mark found himself sitting in the director's office, a sleek, modern space with walls lined with awards, posters, and photographs of celebrated musicians. It felt worlds away from the small room where Mark had once practiced in isolation, just him and his piano pouring everything into the music. The director sat across from him, leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "I have to admit, Mark," the director began, his tone almost contemplative, "I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've seen a lot of talented musicians come and go, but you—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're different. What you did in that audition, well, let's just say it wasn't like anything I've seen before." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had heard words like this before, from teachers and mentors who had tried to push him, but hearing it from someone as experienced and respected as the director made it feel more real. More important. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this," Mark admitted, looking down at his hands. "I've spent so long just playing in the shadows. I didn't expect anything like this. I don't think I ever thought I would be this visible." The director leaned forward, his eyes sharp yet warm. "The world doesn't care if you're ready or not, Mark. Talent like yours, the world will find you whether you're ready or not. You have a gift, and it's time to stop hiding it. It's time for you to embrace what you can do." Mark's gaze flickered up to meet the director's. The words were heavy, almost too much to bear. He had never thought of himself as someone with a gift. It felt strange, almost like a label he didn't want to accept. He had simply played the piano because it was the one thing that made sense to him in a world that often didn't. But now, hearing the director speak about his talent in such grand terms, Mark couldn't help but wonder, was he really ready to take the next step? The director continued, his voice steady. "I know it's a lot to process, but we've got big plans for you. There's a place for you in this competition. But more than that, there's a future waiting for you. A career. It won't be easy, but I think you're ready to take that leap. I'll help you every step of the way." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had always been the quiet, humble boy, unsure of his place in the world. The idea of stepping into the limelight, of becoming someone people admired, seemed almost too distant. Yet, deep inside, a small spark of something began to grow. A feeling he had buried for so long. Hope. "What do I need to do?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with a newfound resolve. The director smiled. "You've already done the hardest part, believing in yourself. Now it's time to work. to refine what you have, and of course, to show the world who you really are. The music business can be tough, but I believe you have what it takes to not only survive, but thrive." Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of the conversation sinking in. The director's words echoed in his mind, mixing with the memory of his performance, the rawness, the emotion, the music that had come straight from his heart. It had all led him to this moment, this decision. Mark wasn't sure if he was truly ready for everything that lay ahead. But one thing was certain. He had a story to tell through his music, and he wasn't going to let anyone silence it. As the conversation continued, plans began to take shape. The competition was just the beginning, and Mark could feel the path ahead becoming clearer. It was no longer just about proving himself in a single audition. It was about carving out a place in the world for his music, for his voice. The world would soon know who Mark was, and he was ready to show them. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind for Mark, as if time itself had been fast-forwarded. The director, true to his word, became both a mentor and a guide, helping Mark navigate the complexities of the music world. The competition that had once seemed like an intimidating hurdle was now a part of a much larger plan, a path that, if Mark played his cards right, would lead him to places he had never dreamed of. The pressure was mounting, but so was Mark's determination. Every day felt like a new challenge. Mark spent hours at the piano, honing his skills, refining his pieces, and pushing himself beyond the boundaries he had once set for himself. His fingers moved more confidently across the keys, the notes flowing with a grace he hadn't known he was capable of. With every practice session, he found himself slipping deeper into the music, losing track of time as he immersed himself in the emotions he sought to express. It was no longer just about playing the piano. It was about telling stories, about capturing moments in time and weaving them into sound. But as much as Mark poured his heart into his music, there was still the looming uncertainty, the world beyond the piano that he hadn't quite prepared for. He was thrust into interviews, photo shoots, and meetings with people who saw him as a commodity, a potential success story. At first, it all felt alien to him, a strange dance he wasn't sure how to perform. The bright lights, the cameras, the people who wanted to mold him into something he hadn't yet figured out how to be it, was overwhelming. It was during one of these photo shoots that Mark first encountered the true weight of fame. The photographer, a sleek professional with an air of impatience, barked orders at him, trying to get the perfect shot. "Look more serious. Now smile. No, not that much, just a little. Hold your piano key like it's a treasure," she instructed. Mark struggled to understand how to appear the way they wanted him to, how to make himself fit into a mold he had never created for himself. As the shoot progressed, Mark couldn't help but feel detached from it all. It wasn't the music. It wasn't what he had dreamed of when he first touched the piano as a child. This was something else, something he hadn't prepared for. The boy who had once played to escape the world now had to figure out how to engage with it in a way that made sense. His mind kept wandering back to the sound of the piano, the way it felt when his fingers touched the keys. That was where he truly belonged, but the challenges continued to grow. The pressure from the competition, combined with the constant need to maintain an image, began to take a toll on Mark. He would lie awake at night, his mind racing with questions. Was he just another product now, shaped by the expectations of others? Or could he still be the artist, the boy who had simply wanted to play music from his heart? It wasn't until one evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, that Mark found the answer to his own question. He was alone in a practice room, the soft hum of the piano filling the empty space. It was late, and the only light in the room came from a dim overhead bulb. He had been working on a new piece, one that was more challenging than anything he had attempted before. But for some reason that night, everything seemed to click. The notes flowed with an ease that surprised him, and the melody he created was pure, unfiltered, and raw. It was as if the piano, once a mere instrument, had become an extension of himself, a conduit for his deepest emotions. In that moment, Mark realized something important. He didn't need to conform to the expectations of the industry. He didn't need to be the polished, perfect image that everyone seemed to want him to be. He had something far more valuable: his authenticity. The real Mark, the boy who had once played in solitude, who had poured his soul into every piece of music, was the one that mattered. And if the world was going to listen to him, it had to listen to that version of him, the unfiltered, unpolished, true artist. The next day, Mark made a decision that would change everything. He told the director he was ready not just for the competition, but for something deeper. He was ready to show the world who he truly was, flaws and all. No more trying to fit into a mold, no more pretending to be what others expected. He was going to be Mark, the boy who played the piano with everything he had, without worrying about the image or the success that would come. The director, always perceptive, saw the change in Mark immediately. He knew that Mark had reached a turning point. This wasn't just about competing anymore. This was about Mark taking control of his own narrative, deciding who he was going to be in the world of music. The next performance, the one that would determine his place in the competition, came quickly. But Mark didn't focus on the prize anymore. He focused on the music, the piece he had been perfecting in the solitude of the practice room. It was a piece born from his heart, a song that told the story of his struggles and triumphs. And when he sat at that piano, under the bright lights and the watchful eyes of the judges, he knew he was ready. Not because he had perfected every note or nailed the technicalities, but because he had finally found his voice. As Mark began to play, the room fell silent. His fingers moved with a newfound confidence, the music pouring out effortlessly, as if the piano was no longer just an instrument, but an extension of his soul. Each note was a piece of himself, a raw, honest expression that connected with the audience on a level far deeper than any perfectly executed performance ever could. And in that moment, Mark understood what the director had been trying to tell him all along. To truly succeed, he needed to stop being what others wanted him to be and simply be himself. Mark played not for the judges, not for the audience, but for himself. And it was the most powerful performance of his life. The days following Mark's transformative performance were a blur of excitement, media frenzy, and mounting pressure. The audience had been stunned, and the judges, no longer holding back their admiration, were quick to praise his authenticity and talent. But for Mark, the aftermath felt strangely quiet. He had crossed an invisible line, stepping into a world that now demanded his attention, his presence. The applause, the recognition, all of it had felt surreal. What mattered most to him, though, was the music, the way it had connected him with something deeper inside himself. But that moment, that raw, honest performance, had changed everything. The competition, now a distant concern, seemed secondary to the larger conversation Mark had found himself in. The industry, the world of music, had begun to take notice, and suddenly, Mark was thrust into the limelight. No longer just the boy who had walked into the audition room with uncertainty. He was now a symbol of potential, a story the media couldn't get enough of. Headlines screamed of his rise, the quiet genius who had stunned everyone with a single performance. Record labels were already in contact, eager to sign him, eager to be part of his future. The buzz around him was undeniable, but behind it all, Mark remained the same boy he had always been, a little unsure, a little overwhelmed, but more determined than ever to stay true to himself. One morning, just a few days after the performance, Mark received an unexpected call from the director. His voice was serious, yet there was a note of excitement that Mark hadn't heard before. "Mark, I've been talking to a few people," the director said, pacing as he spoke. "This competition, it's just the beginning. You've got real potential. And there's something I need you to understand. It's not just about the prize or the accolades. It's about what you can do next, what you're going to do with all of this attention." Mark felt a flicker of nervousness, but the director's words resonated. He had spent so much of his life playing music for himself, and now the world was watching. His music had to mean something, had to be more than just a performance. It had to speak for something beyond fame, beyond the expectations of others. Look, Mark, the director continued, there are opportunities opening up, and they're going to come fast. Record labels want you. But we both know that the business side of things can get messy. They'll try to change you, mold you into what they think will sell. And I need to know, are you ready for that? Mark sat still, letting the weight of the question sink in. He had always been aware of the dangers of fame, the way it could distort and change people, twisting them into something they weren't. But the choice was his now. It wasn't about whether he wanted success, it was about how he wanted to get there, and who he wanted to be along the way. I'm ready, Mark said quietly, his voice steady. He had come this far, and now he had to trust himself. But I won't be anyone else. I won't let them turn me into something I'm not. The director paused before responding, and when he did, his voice held a note of approval. Good, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. From that moment on, Mark began to take control of his own destiny. He wasn't just a player in a competition anymore. He was an artist with a vision. The offers came in rapidly: record contracts, endorsement deals, invitations to perform at prestigious events. But Mark, ever the introvert, wasn't ready to dive into the chaos just yet. He needed time to process everything, to find his own path in the world that had suddenly opened up to him. He had come to understand that success wasn't measured by the number of deals he signed or the number of stages he performed on. It was measured by how true he remained to his own music, to the emotions that had driven him to the piano in the first place. The first real test of his resolve came when he was offered a lucrative recording contract by a major label, one of the biggest in the world. The meeting was a whirlwind. Executives lined up to greet him, each eager to offer their vision of how Mark's music could be packaged, marketed, and sold. They had all seen his audition, heard the buzz, and they were convinced that he could be the next big star. But as they spoke, Mark felt something inside him stir a sense of unease, like he was being asked to become something he wasn't. It wasn't that the offer wasn't tempting. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. But as the executives spoke about shaping his image, turning him into a household name, Mark realized he wasn't ready to be someone else. He wasn't interested in being a product. He was a musician, a storyteller. And the music he played had to remain true to the feelings he wanted to express, not to some corporate vision of what would sell. Thank you for the offer, Mark said, standing up with a calm that surprised even him. But I'm not interested in being anyone else. I need to find my own way. And I won't compromise the music. The room fell silent, the executives exchanging confused glances. But Mark stood firm. This was his moment. The music had brought him here, and it was the music that would guide him forward. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. As Mark left the meeting, a strange sense of peace washed over him. He had made the right choice. He had taken the first step in carving out his own path, one that didn't depend on fame or fortune, but on his own authenticity. He wasn't ready to be the world's next pop sensation. He was ready to be Mark, a musician, an artist, someone who played the piano with his whole heart. And that was enough. It was a decision that would change everything. Mark would go on to sign with a smaller independent label that shared his vision. He would perform at smaller, intimate venues where the music could truly connect with the audience. And slowly, the world would come to understand Mark's music wasn't about selling records or being famous. It was about telling his story and letting the world listen. Mark's journey, though just beginning, had already taken him through a maze of choices, each more significant than the last. With every passing day, he felt the weight of his decision to remain true to himself, to his music, and to the reasons he had first started playing the piano. It had been months since that unforgettable audition, And now, Mark stood at the edge of something even more extraordinary, a future that was his to shape. But as he took each step forward, he realized that his story was more than just a tale of overcoming obstacles. It was a testament to the power of authenticity, of staying true to one's roots, even when the world seemed intent on pulling you in 1,000 different directions. In the months that followed, Mark began to perform regularly at small, intimate venues. These weren't the grand concert halls or the prestigious arenas where stars were born overnight. Instead, they were cozy, tucked-away spaces that welcomed artists who sought to connect with their audience in a way that was real and unguarded. It was in these quiet rooms, lit by soft, dimmed lights, that Mark discovered the true power of his music. At first, he was nervous. Would people understand? Would they come? But each performance was a revelation. As Mark played, he began to realize that the audience didn't just come to hear the music, they came to feel it. His hands on the keys, his soul in every note, all of it created an invisible thread that connected him to the people in the room. Some closed their eyes as they listened, others let tears slip quietly down their cheeks. Mark had no words to explain it, but every time he played, he knew he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. The music had become his voice, his true voice. And it was through it that he spoke to the world. Word began to spread about the boy who played the piano, not just with technical prowess, but with emotion that stirred something deeper. The more intimate shows led to bigger opportunities, and Mark found himself performing at larger venues, each one a new challenge, but one he felt ready to face. His music was never about being perfect. It was about honesty, about giving everything he had to each piece, no matter the size of the crowd. The audience could hear it, feel it. It wasn't just notes and rhythms, it was Mark. His heart lay bare for all to see. But while Mark's music was making waves, it was also beginning to influence the industry around him. His refusal to conform to the pressures of the commercial music world, his insistence on staying true to his artistic vision, was being noticed. The record labels that had initially offered him deals were now reaching out again, but the terms had changed. Mark wasn't the same boy who had walked into the audition room months ago. He had built a name for himself based on his own terms. No longer was he the raw talent that needed to be shaped. Now he was the one with power, the one who would decide how his story was told. It was a turning point in his career. The world had watched him rise, not because of how he fit into the mold, but because he had created his own. The music industry was changing around him, slowly but surely, as more and more artists followed Mark's lead, choosing authenticity over perfection, expression over formula. Mark had sparked something bigger than himself. And in this new world, his voice was leading the charge. One evening, after a particularly emotional performance at a sold-out show in a renowned venue, Mark sat backstage, exhausted but fulfilled. His hands were still warm from playing, his mind still wrapped in the energy of the crowd. It was then that the director, the one who had first seen the spark in him, appeared backstage. The man who had once joked about kneeling before him now stood in awe, his face reflecting the pride he felt. "You did it," the director said, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Mark looked at him, the weight of the words sinking in. He had done it, but it wasn't just about success or fame. It was about remaining true to the music that had always been his compass, about staying grounded in the very thing that had brought him here. "I didn't do it alone," Mark replied, his voice soft. "I had help, and I had the music. That's what made all of this possible." The director smiled, nodding slowly. He had seen Mark's potential from the start, but now, watching him perform, watching him transform into the artist he had always known he could be, was something else entirely. Over the following years, Mark's influence grew. He continued to perform, write, and release music that resonated with his growing fan base, a fan base that admired not just his talent, but his unwavering commitment to his craft. He became a voice for artists who felt that their music, their stories, mattered. In interviews, he spoke about the importance of staying true to oneself, of not letting the noise of the world drown out your inner voice. His success was measured not by the number of awards he won, but by the people whose lives were touched by his music. Mark's legacy, however, was more than just the music he created. It was the example he set for others, the boy who had once doubted himself, who had almost let the world define him, and who had chosen instead to define himself. In choosing to be authentic, Mark had carved out a space where others could do the same. And in the end, that was the most important thing of all. As he sat at his piano one quiet evening, the weight of everything he had accomplished settled over him. He was exactly where he was meant to be, not because he had followed a path laid out for him, but because he had created his own. And with every note he played, Mark knew that the journey was far from over. He had started a new chapter in a story that was still being written, one note at a time.